So, brothers and sisters and friends, today is day 3. We're going to take a look at Mary and her discipleship in community. Now, our discipleship is enacted in community. We are not sent to mountaintops, except when we go to cafes, to work out our salvation by ourselves. It is enacted in community. We are purposefully set in ecclesias. We are amongst folks who believe the gospel, are baptized, the ones that hope in the exceeding great and precious promises that God has made. We are in the midst, in community, of those called out to manifest God's character and who look to Christ as the head. And our interactions with each other are consequential. In Romans 14 we read, "But why do you judge your brother? Or why do you show contempt for your brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. So then, each of us shall give account of himself to God. Therefore, let us not judge one another anymore, but rather resolve this, not to put a stumbling block or a cause to fall in our brother's way." We know that Jesus takes our interactions with each other in community personally. "As you've done it unto the least of these, my brethren, you've done it unto me." And when he confronts Paul on the road to Damascus, he doesn't say, "You're persecuting my followers." He says, "You're persecuting me." So our interactions in community are mandatory and they're consequential. And it's really how we show our discipleship. So here are some principles of God's community. First of all, it's a family. It's not an organization or a club. We read in John 1, starting in verse 12, "But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God." Can you see Mary's influence on John here? Who else had an experience like that, where a birth was not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God? And so I think Mary understood her experience with Jesus as a kind of prototype of those born to be children of God. And we know that Brother Thomas wisely stated that the grand purpose of the eternal Spirit is not human salvation, but God manifestation. That's widely quoted. But in the next couple sentences, he says something that's equally important. He says, "The eternal Spirit intended to enthrone himself on the earth, and in so doing, develop a divine family from among men, every one of whom shall be spirit, because they're born of the Spirit, and that family shall be large enough to fill the whole earth." Have we forgotten that our community is a family? Do we think it's an organization or a club? We know that another principle is that God chooses and arranges the members of his family according to his plan and purpose. We read in 1 Corinthians 12:18 in the Mount's translation, "God arranged the members in the body, every one of them, just as he chose." And we read, "If one member suffers, all the members suffer with it," because that's the next one. We're interdependent, and we need each other. In 1 Corinthians 12, going on, we see that another principle is that family members that are the least esteemed are the ones that are needed most. And Jesus tells us that our relationships are going to be the mark of how people will know that we are his disciples. "By this will all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another." And members don't get to say to each other, "I don't need you." Mary's going to experience that as she heads north to Nazareth. And brothers and sisters and friends, sadly, we experience that sometimes in our community. I've experienced that. To have brothers and sisters say to me, "I don't need you." I've seen that said to my wife. Tragically, I've seen that said to my kids. We don't get to do that. We do not get to say, I don't need you. So, last day's discussion was awesome. Just an update to the QR code. I took a picture of all the tremendous paraphrases of Mary's songs that you did, so that's up. So if you want to refresh the QR code, you can do that. So Mary and Elizabeth, we know, had this rich relationship. And Henri Nouwen says something really powerful about Elizabeth and Mary and community. He says that I find the meeting of these two women very moving because Elizabeth and Mary came together and enabled each other to wait. These two women created space for each other to wait. They affirmed for each other that something was happening that was worth waiting for. I think that this is the model of the Christian community. It is a community of support, celebration, and affirmation in which we can lift up what has already begun in us. The visit of Elizabeth and Mary is one of the Bible's most beautiful expressions of what it means to form community, to be together, gathered around a promise, affirming that something is really happening. Is that beautiful? And as we live in the last days, should not be our community. As we see prophecies being fulfilled right in front of our very eyes, we're gathered together around a promise, affirming that something is really happening. So, Mary returns to her community. That's recorded for us in Luke and in Matthew. It says that she's found with child, which we would understand to be that she was visibly pregnant. It's quite clear that the community and Joseph understood that that was something that happened before they came together. And it seems that Mary is alone in this community. There's a strong sense that kind of is a subtext that people in the community would be saying, I have no need of you. So, you think about Mary's thoughts with Elizabeth. She has this totally supportive community where she didn't have to reveal this unique experience that she was undergoing. It was revealed through the power of God. I don't know if you would do this if you're in Mary's shoes, but I'd be like, can't I just stay here for a while? But that wasn't God's plan. God's plan was that Mary would go back to Nazareth, back to the community that God had arranged in Nazareth. But that's where growth happens, isn't it? That's where growth happens as a disciple. So Mary returns to her community. It would have been a community that knew her well. I think that it's logical. If anybody wants to buy me a McAfee subscription so that doesn't keep popping up, just let me know. See me later. Okay, Nicholas, could you come up? I lost my cursor. Yeah, I know it's there. I can't see it on my screen. Okay. Yeah, it's not coming up on my screen. That's okay. We'll keep going. That's okay.
Just move it like off of the screen and it'll come to yours.
Okay. Ah, you're a genius. So we would infer, because of Mary's just impressive character, that people would have been surprised by her quote-unquote immorality. Mary did not share the truth broadly with her community, and in doing so, she risks her life to do that. And it appears that Mary did not share the truth with Joseph. As we'll see, there's a divine intervention via a dream that intervenes when Joseph, being a just man, sought to put her away privately. So she's silent. She's silent. Now, as a result of this conflict, Mary suffers and learns as a part of God's plan. And there are some messianic Old Testament passages that clearly apply to Christ, but that also Mary would have understood really well. Like in Psalm 69, because for your sake I have borne reproach, shame has covered my face. And of course, the passage in Isaiah, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. So think of the conversations that Mary would have had with Jesus. I don't know about you, but as a parent, I made lots of mistakes. But one of the things that I did well was when my kids were struggling with something that I really struggled with, boy, I understood that. You know how I knew that I understood it? Is because I didn't give them any easy answers. So Mary suffers in silence, and she's able to share that experience, I believe, later with Jesus. So what are we going to do in this community? Well, we read in Matthew 1, her husband Joseph was a just man and unwilling to disgrace her in public, so he planned to release her quietly. And this word just occurs all over in the New Testament. It's usually in the context of observance of the law, but it also means righteous. We see that Joseph was unwilling to disgrace her in public. So he's making a self-sacrifice there, right? He's not willing to throw Mary under the bus. He's willing to shoulder some of the pain himself. This word disgrace in public is only used one other time in Hebrews 6, where it talks about crucifying the Son of God afresh and putting him to a public shame. So it's quite a profound sense. So quietly, Joseph didn't ask for Mary to be stoned. He didn't ask for the water test of the unfaithful woman. And he didn't ask for the bride price to be returned, as far as we know. So as he pondered this, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for that which has been conceived in her is by the Holy Spirit, and she will bear a son, and you are to call him Jesus, for he will save people from his sins. So this word pondered is a very, very important word, and we're going to talk about it in just a sec. But before we do that, I think that one of the reasons why these four special women are in Matthew chapter 1 and in the genealogy of Joseph is that I think all four of these amazing women were on Joseph's mind as he pondered what to do with the situation that confronted him. You know, Tamar and Rahab and Ruth and Bathsheba, all four of these descendants would have had so much with Mary's current circumstance. They were marginalized by the community. There was the suggestion of sexual impropriety, and all were proved righteous in the end. So as he thought of what he was going to do after he decided to put away privately, it says that he thought. Now this is a really interesting word. It means to be in a passionate frame of mind, easily agitated, quickly moved by strong provoking impulses. It only occurs a couple other times, and there it has the suggestion of someone trying to work through cognitive dissonance. So in Acts 10, it's when Peter receives the dream, about the Gentiles, and he's like, well, how do I make sense of this? It seems to be counter to everything that I understand about God. So we get a sense of how emotionally invested Joseph is in trying to sort this out. So we have the situation where there's a huge chunk of the community is saying to Mary, I have no need of you. And then we have Joseph being compassionate, but still in a much more merciful way saying that. And then there's the divine intervention to say, no, Joseph, son of David, this is what you need to do. And so that's a lesson for us, because God arranged the community at Nazareth just like he arranges our community. And there are some people that are going to make some decisions, and there are other people that need to stand up like Joseph. Stand up like Joseph. Kenneth Bailey, who's a scholar who sadly has passed away, he lived many years in the Middle East and has a tremendous understanding. I'd commend to you his work on the prodigal son. But this is what he says. He says, Matthew presents Joseph as a human being of remarkable spiritual stature. He possesses the boldness, daring, courage, and strength of character to stand up against his entire community and take Mary as his wife. He did so in spite of forces that no doubt wanted her stoned. His vision of justice stayed his hand. In short, he was able to reprocess his anger, because that's what that Greek word is suggestive of, reprocess his anger into grace. Reprocess his anger into grace. I feel like that's speaking to me. Because, those of you that know me know that I have issues with anger. And I'm good at anger. I'm good at grudge holding. What I'm not good is turning that into grace. And one of the things that I'm angry about, and I remain angry about until I can process it into grace, is the fact that people have told my children, I have no need of you. But I'm called, aren't I? I'm called to be like Joseph and repurpose that anger into grace. Because that's the only way we're going to move forward. That's the only way we're going to move forward. And God has arranged the community to have that happen. God has arranged that community for us to be able to grow in grace. To grow in grace. We're called to be like Joseph. So Joseph and Mary show us how to live in community between the two cups. To trust in God, to work in the community that He has arranged. He has arranged the community. Joseph and Mary show us not to revile when being reviled by others in the community. The whole mean girl phenomenon is not a phenomenon of the 21st century. You can imagine what Mary was subjected to when she returned. Joseph and Mary show us that we bear each other's burdens, especially the marginalized. They show us that we demonstrate righteousness through mercy. And they show us to reprocess anger into grace. I'm a student of families. When I was born, my parents weren't married. They never got married. Met my father for the first time when I was 15. When I was 4, my mother was declared unfit. So I was given custody of my grandparents. My grandfather died when I was 9. And so I'm a student of families. I would go to, my friends' houses and see how families work. And I'd see in our ecclesial family how things work or didn't work. But I know this. The family of God saved my life. And I know this, that in any family situation, there are 2 things that are required to function. One is commitment. I'm not going anywhere. To whom shall we go? We believe and know that thou art the Christ and hast the words of eternal life. The first is commitment, and the second is grace, the extension of grace. So, as we live in this community, as we live in this family, we think about commitment and we think about grace. Now, Joseph and Mary traveled to a new community. So this is the part where I start to explode common perceptions about Joseph and Mary. I'm sorry you'll never be able to watch the Charlie Brown Christmas special in the same way again. Apologize that another time. So it seems like before they would have traveled to this new community, to Bethlehem, they would have taken up the wedding cup. It would have been a quite subdued service, no doubt. Luke 2:5, where it talks about taking his betrothed wife, it shouldn't be understood that the marriage hadn't taken place, rather that it hadn't been consummated yet. The scholar David Fincey writes, "Took her as his wife need not mean that there was no feast. True, it is not mentioned, but culture pressed for it." So there would have been a ceremony before they would have been allowed to go off together to Bethlehem for the census. So Micah 5:2 is well understood. We know that from the account in Herod's court in Matthew, is well understood to be the birthplace of Messiah. So Jesus should be born in Bethlehem. How do we make that happen? And so it seems like the census requirement would have been an answer to their prayers. So they head down, and they would have gone down with a whole bunch of other Galileans, because we know that around 80 BC, Alexander Jannaeus sent thousands of Judeans north to settle Galilee. Therefore, Mary and Joseph likely went in a group whose grandparents moved from Judea to Galilee. So even though they traveled with other folks who are in the same circumstance, can you imagine Mary and Joseph's dialogue on their journey? Now, I don't know if you remember this, if you've been blessed to have kids, but do you remember taking your first kid home from the hospital? You kind of look at each other like, what do we do now? And so multiply that by 1,000 is the great responsibility that Joseph and Mary had in terms of raising the Son of God. So I think that this journey would have allowed them time for dialogue. Now, we're going to talk, God willing, about the wise men on Friday. But it seems like Bethlehem became their new home if we kind of piece things together. Luke omits the incident with Herod. And then when it talks about Luke 2:39 returning to their home, that seems to be read as occurring when the family returned from Egypt. We know that they were living in Bethlehem eventually because they're in a house when the wise men show up. Jesus is a young child, not an infant, and Herod has that cushion of 2 years and under. Okay, now let's take a look at the birth. There's no room at the inn. So we're thinking Motel 6 or something, right? That's not what this word means. This word in kataluma means a guest chamber. And how do we know that it means that for Luke especially? Is because he uses that word to describe the upper room where Jesus celebrated the institution of the Lord's Supper. We know that it's not the version of Motel 6 because in the parable of the Good Samaritan, the Samaritan put the injured person up in a place, and it wasn't a kataluma, it was a pendacheon. So for Luke, we know pretty clearly that we're not talking about some other kind of residence. So I would suggest to you that since Joseph was traveling back to a family place, that he would have stayed with family. So the whole idea of them being by themselves and being turned away, I don't think that the text bears that out. Now, mangers were not a separate building, but they were part of a home. So if you take a look at this, and this is from Kenneth Bailey's work, this is the floor plan of a house in Judea at that time. There would have been the kataluma, the guest room, there would have been the family living room, then the mangers, and then the stable. And then sometimes houses were built near caves or grottos that could be used as the stable. And that perhaps accounts for the depiction of Jesus being born in a cave that's preserved in the Proto-Evangelium of James, and also a really active tourist site in the Israel area right now. But it seems like they would have been with family, and it seems like there would have been this opportunity to be not in the kataluma, but to be in the manger. If you want to continue with Sunday school plays about the Nativity, as you've always done, please feel free. This is just information for you to use at your discretion. So why a manger? Why a manger? Well, I think for two reasons. The first is that it gives us insight into Mary's frame of mind, because this is a rare word, and it occurs in the Septuagint here in Habakkuk. Though the flock may be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, same word as manger, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation, which is such a powerful echo of Mary's song, "The Lord is my strength." So that kind of gives us some insight into Mary's mindset as this was happening. And I think what's also there, because it was the sign, the semeion, which is we're going to see quite a bit today, the sign given to the shepherds. Now, why shepherds? Why shepherds? Pretty random, right? Did any of you, when you brought your kid home, any shepherds show up on the lawn? No, it's unique. It was unique too in Jesus' day as well. So I think what it's getting across is that it was support from an unexpected part of the community. And Jesus was a child of the community. Because remember, the angel says, "Unto you a child is born." Not unto Mary a child is born. He says, "Unto you a child is born." Just like in Isaiah 9, "For unto us a child is born. Unto us a son is given." Jesus is a child of the community, and our children are children of the community. And let's celebrate that we do that tremendously well in our community. That our kids are our kids, and they're blessed to have aunts and uncles all over the place. Let's celebrate that we do that well. Now, shepherd at that time was a despised profession. Joachim Jeremias, in his book Jerusalem in the Time of Jesus, said, "At that time the rabbis asked with amazement how, in the view of the despicable nature of shepherds, one can explain why God was called my shepherd in Psalm 23. So they weren't a high-status occupation. But these were special shepherds, I think. Edersheim suggests that these were the shepherds that were watching the flocks exclusively destined for the temple sacrifice, the morning and the evening lamb. So they show up, and it's an unexpected support from the community. Now, in our community, in our family, have you ever received support from an unexpected place? All the time, right? And usually that happens when you've shared your story or made yourself vulnerable. So I'm just going to be really quick here. I know we're running on time. There was a sister in a meeting that I used to go to who, when I first met her, I thought, my goodness, this is perhaps the meanest old lady in the world. And so we didn't really hit it off. And we had this ecclesial get-together. Actually, it was an ecclesial get-together that I think Sister Tamara organized. And I was in her group. And she shared the fact that when she was 14, her parents left her at a house, and she never saw her parents again. And we bonded. And I would have never expected that this mean old lady would ever be such a valuable support for me. See, God arranges us in families so that we can get support from expected places and unexpected places. And this would have been an unexpected place from the shepherds. So it says Mary kept all these things and pondered them in her heart. It means preserved, and there's a similar use in the Septuagint for Daniel. Pondered literally means to kind of throw things together. So she's thinking about this. She's thinking about the shepherd. She's thinking about their message. She's thinking about their role with the lamb. And then she has an opportunity, I think, to act on it. So Jesus as the lamb. We know that the lamb occurs 35 times in the New Testament, 31 times in John. So I'm going to suggest that one of the things that Mary thought about with the appearance of the shepherds, and who were specially destined to take care of the sacrificial lamb, is that she started to think that God will provide for himself the lamb, much as Abraham did. So when they go to the temple to observe the necessary rites, I think that it's a possibility that they chose not to offer a lamb because the providers of the sacrificial lamb came to her, the shepherds came to her, and extolled the one born Savior, who is Christ the Lord. Now, the traditional explanation of that, of course, is that they were poor and they gave the poor person's offering. That makes total sense, too. But I also urge you to consider that maybe there was a reason why they didn't offer a lamb, and maybe it was connected to Mary's experience with the shepherds. So, community. They come to the center of community. 40 days after Jesus' birth, they give the offering that was required in Leviticus. It's the consecration of the firstborn. They would have entered at the gate of the firstborn. They would have waited at the Nicanor gate. You can see that up on the screen. They would have waited there for the priest. Once the priest came and got them, they would have brought them in to the court of the woman. And it appears that that is where the interaction with Anna and Simeon occurred, in the court of the woman. So, they come to the center of community, and they find affirmation. When the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him according to the custom of the law, what happens? They're fulfilling the requirements. This happens. And he took him up in his arms and blessed God and said, Lord, now you are letting your servant depart in peace according to your word, for my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to bring revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of your people Israel. So, what's the impact? The impact is that they marvel. And this is a key aspect of discipleship, the practice of marveling. And his father and mother were marveling at the things being spoken about him. Have you ever felt like not going to meeting or Bible class or something?
Oh, never.
Okay, good. Thank you. We have an honest person. Yeah, that all happens, right? But have you ever had that experience where you go and you get there, and then an interaction with another member of God's family leaves you marveling? I've had that. I mean, I've had the experience where I just sit there and I look around at all these people and I think, we're so blessed to have each other. Like, you look in this room, and there were people here that would literally do anything for you. We need to never lose our sense of marveling that God has arranged our community the way it is. And one of the ways that that's reinforced is by getting together and seeing each other and following the ordinances that have been set for us. So they're marveling. They're marveling at things that were said. Simeon said, behold, this child is destined for the fall and rising of many in Israel, and for a sign, it's a Greek word Simeon, which will be spoken against. Yes, a sword will pierce through you as well, that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed. So Simeon blesses both Joseph and Mary, but only speaks to Mary. Mary has anticipated some of what Simeon's saying, right? It's in her song, the idea of God, overturning the existing structure. And Simeon confirms Mary's hopes and fears. Her son will provide salvation, but will face many painful challenges that she will share. And I have to say that sharing in suffering is part of community. Paul writes, and if one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. For if one member is honored, all members rejoice with it. We're interconnected. That's how God has arranged things to be. True community means that we will share in each other's sufferings just as we share in each other's joys. Henri Nouwen said something very profound. He said, a community is the result, is the fruit of shared brokenness. Now, we see Anna. So she's a prophetess, and that's used in the Septuagint to refer to Miriam and Deborah and Huldah. She appears to have been a fixture at the temple, and I think it's a safe inference that she and Mary have maybe had an existing relationship through Elizabeth. It seems like if you were any person coming up to the temple, but especially a very spiritual young woman, that you would gravitate towards Anna. And she consistently spread the good news about Jesus. So affirmation in community, but you have to be there. You have to be amongst each other in community. You have to show up. So let's fast forward 30 years. So they're directed by God to settle back in her community. Mary seems to be tightly connected to Nazareth. We know at age 12, one of the reasons that they lose Jesus is because they have so many acquaintances and family, right? There's so many of them that they just figure Jesus is with one of that group. So they seem to be well enmeshed and well accepted in the Nazareth community when Jesus is age 12. During Jesus' ministry, it seems that Mary and her family were well known throughout the region. Not just in Nazareth, but also in Capernaum. In the great discourse at Capernaum, one of the responses is, isn't this Jesus whose mother and father we know? 30 years have gone by. John begins his preparatory work. Jesus leaves to be baptized by John. Shameless plug for a tidings book by Brother Paul Zilmer called Those Who Stood By Me. It's an excellent book. I'd ask you to not only purchase it, but leave a 5-star review on Amazon. And he has a wonderful chapter in it where he kind of speculates on what it would have been like, the conversation that Jesus would have had with Mary as he leaves to be baptized by John. So Jesus is now returning to Nazareth with his followers in time for a community event, a wedding in nearby Cana. So, there was a wedding in Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Now, both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. And when they ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? Mine hour is not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." So, some things jump out, right? First of all, John never calls Jesus' mother by name, which is interesting because, Mary would have lived with John after the crucifixion. It's kind of a parallel account of mother and woman that we see in the cross, right? In John 19, now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. So this idea of the mother of Jesus being referred to as a woman is something that happens throughout the Gospel of John. We see that Mary is a commanding presence, right? She kind of jumps off the page. She seems to be influential and a community problem solver. And just as she was implicitly compared with Zacharias, here she's implicitly compared to the governor, right? The governor's just clueless. He's like, "Oh, good wine at the end. How did that happen?" Meanwhile, Mary had solved the problem, right? The very problem the governor should have been addressing. Now, the issue is they have no wine. They have no wine. Jesus says to her, "Woman." Now, Vincent, a really highly esteemed Greek scholar, kind of speaks for the group when he says that this means a highly respectful and affectionate mode of address. The Greek word is gune. And it doesn't mean woman. I don't know what it's like in your household, but if I came home and said to Kathy, "Woman," things would go downhill from there. That's not the sense that we get here, right? It is a respectful and affectionate mode of address. Jesus says, what is that to me and to you? Really, the Greek there suggests that this doesn't really concern either of us. And then he says something really significant. He says, "My hour." Now, in John, the phrase "my hour" refers to a kind of a turning point in Jesus' ministry. In John 7:30, we read, "Therefore they sought to take him, but no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come." So he had pushed in his great discourse in John 7, the religious rulers as far as he could, and they wanted to grab him, but he escaped. Similarly, in John 8, these words Jesus spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple, and no one laid hands on him, for his hour had not yet come. So Jesus is saying, the tipping point isn't here yet. But it's interesting, Mary seems to just ignore that. And then she doesn't even continue speaking to Jesus. She says to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." So my sense of it is that Mary prompted Messiah to show himself to the community. Mary believes, despite seeing no previous sign, that Jesus will solve the problem through miraculous means. Because Mary had remembered Simeon's promise that Jesus would be a sign, would be a Simeon. And in fact, Jesus' hour had come, right? We read in John 2, what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. So this was the first sign, and as a result, his disciples believed in him. And isn't it significant that Jesus' first sign is done in community? Done in perhaps the most joyful event that a community could have, that of a wedding. And brothers and sisters and friends, I would submit to you that in community, Mary finally sees her marriage cup filled to overflowing. I don't think Mary had this joyous multi-day wedding celebration, but she's determined that this community celebration will be the joyous one that she didn't get to experience. And this is a foreshadowing of her role in the early ecclesia that, God willing, we're going to talk about on Friday. What an amazing community we would have if everybody was determined to ensure that the negative experiences that they had were not visited on anybody else. Mary is determined, and she acts to ensure that there's harmony in God's family. So, what can we say about Mary the disciple in community? We can say that she trusts God to work in community because she recognizes that that's community that he has arranged. We can trust Mary's example when we see that she did not revile when reviled by others in the community. I don't know what the advice would be if the Gospels were written in the 21st century, but I would pretty sure there'd be some comment about emails and social media, right? Do not revile when reviled by others in the community. Bear one another's burdens, especially the marginalized. Demonstrate righteousness through mercy. Reprocess anger into grace. As you interact with community, keep those things, ponder those things, marvel at all the amazing things that God has blessed us with in community, namely each other among many other blessings. Whatever he says to you, do it. Now, is there any more succinct distillation of discipleship than whatever he says to you, do it? And lastly, Mary the disciple teaches us that we refuse to be bitter about community. We refuse to revisit past wrongs. We refuse to hang on to grudges. Instead, we let go of those things and we act to ensure harmony and joy. Mary the disciple teaches us how to act in community. Brothers and sisters and friends, God willing, tomorrow we'll have a discussion where we will try to answer the question, why didn't Mary join her sister Salome in following Jesus throughout his ministry? Why wasn't she one of the women that are mentioned in Luke 8 that attended to his needs?